we got a tail fire. Roger, I got your ready to calm down, buddy. We're gonna be down here. We're not gonna lie. And if nobody can do it, these guys can do it. So just relax and be cool, okay?
We live in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It is in that environment of high speed, high stress chaos that you as a leader must make decisions, communicate those decisions, then ultimately execute those decisions. Your ability to do so will determine your success or failure. Welcome to Decide, Communicate, Execute. Time to lock and load. Here's Gene.
Good afternoon, sports fans. Gene Blanton here. So glad you can be with us. I'm really excited. This is our inaugural episode of Decide, Communicate, and Execute. I am really excited to be a part of this process. I want to thank all the team at Real News Communication, the Real News Communications Network. They have just been absolute pros in getting this off the ground and getting this going. So I'm excited to share it with you. I had the distinct privilege for many years to have Zig Ziglar as my Sunday school teacher. And one of the things that Zig used to always say was, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly till you get it right. And so that's what we're going to do today. We may do it poorly at first, but we're going to ultimately get it right. I'm going to talk to you today in the ongoing series about this concept of leadership. There's all types of definitions. If you put in Google leadership, you will literally get millions and millions of returns on leadership. Some of my background, I'm an entrepreneur, which I tell people is a French word meaning incapable of gainful employment. I'm an old United States Marine. I started my first company when I was 28. We started, I had myself and my beautiful Mississippi wife. We had $20,000 and our two business partners at the time, Youth and Ignorance. We started Summit Communications Incorporated out of our garage. We actually built towers up to 2,000 feet in the air. And so that was my first entree into the world of entrepreneurship. And so in that, growing that company and ultimately selling that company, the only thing I knew was that as a young Marine NCO, a non-commissioned officer, what I'd learned in leadership and what I determined there and what the Marines have taught for since 1775 is the fact that leadership, the essence of it, there's a lot of definitions, but when it really comes down to it, when you really take a look at it, leadership is about making decisions. Then after you've made those decisions, it's ultimately about communicating those decisions, and then what's most important is that those decisions ultimately get executed. So in our environment, in our world today, there is a lot of different ways to lose. If you make a poor decision, regardless of how well that decision is communicated or executed, you're going to lose. If you make a great decision and that decision is poorly communicated to your team, is poorly communicated to your stockholders, your value proposition is poorly communicated to your client base, you're going to lose. And then you can have a great decision, which is communicated well to everyone. And then if that decision is ultimately not executed, you've failed. So that's the essence of leadership. That's what we're going to look at in the coming weeks. I'm very excited. I've got some great guests lined up. Many of those have been folks who have led both on the battlefield that are now leading in the boardrooms around the country. And what we want to share with you is a framework of leadership that works in today's environment. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about the environment. We live in an environment there of high speed, high stress chaos. That's the reality. That is a leader's environment. And so any leadership development or talk about leadership or leadership development program or leadership development book that doesn't take into account the environment in which we live and the environment in which we must have to operate, the environment in which we must have to make decisions, communicate those decisions, and decide those, or ultimately execute those decisions, it is not living up to standards, not living up to the reality of the world that we live in. It's not only high speed, high stress chaos, but we also live in a world of speed. And if you'll look at that next one, Matt, you'll see there Thomas Friedman said, we're no longer in a world where the big eat the small, but where the fast eat the slow. And so for the small business entrepreneur, the small business leader out there, that can become what we call a force multiplier. That's something where you can take a small unit and have a lot of power simply by multiplying its ability to impact the marketplace. And one of those ways to do that is in the area of speed. And so that must be executed in this environment. This high speed, high stress, chaotic environment is an environment that you'll now hear the term, and I challenge you to look it up, Google it, the environment of that they call VUCA. And that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In fact, we're experiencing it right here in the voodoo of high technology here. For some reason, my slides are all jacked up here, but this is normal. This is normal. There's a great scene in We Were Soldiers where Colonel Hal Moore is training his men, and as he's running along beside them, he makes this statement there when he's talking about the chaos of war. He said, men will but die. He said, men will die. This is normal. And so hopefully it's not normal in your environment for people to die, but the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, and ambiguity is very much the environment in which we live today. And I'd like for us to look at those components just for a second of what each of those means. If you look at volatility, this is from an article in Harvard Business Review by Colonel Eric G. Hall. He defined it as a state of dynamic instability brought about by drastic, violent, and rapid shifts. You've seen that. You can give one example today that most everybody can relate to. Can you imagine paying the hundreds of thousands of dollars it was to have a license in a place like New York City to drive a taxi? And now suddenly your industry is turned upside down because of the demand of the marketplace. And with technology, with the onslaught of Uber, now you have all of these guys that are facing unemployment. In fact, I just read about the increase in suicides amongst taxi drivers. Well, guys, there's another answer. Put your big boy pants on and work your way out of this. But the fact is, volatility, if you're unprepared for that, can produce very poor results. The next one that they talk about is uncertainty. And again, Colonel Hall clarifies that or talks about that as a lack of clarity that hinders our ability to conceptualize the threats and challenges facing the organizations we need. Just getting it's one thing to solve a problem once you know what the problem is. But the challenge so many times is that with the uncertainty, we're not even sure as leaders what problem it is that we're trying to solve. And so in a world of uncertainty, the question is, how do you lead in that uncertainty? The next aspect that he talks about is complexity. It's a perspective that goes beyond viewing threats and opportunities as collective but interactive. Who would have thought, as we sit here today on September 11th, 2018, who would have thought that 17 years ago today, some zealots full of evil intent with box cutters could have literally changed the United States forever? Billions and billions and billions of dollars of losses, both in the marketplace and actual damage, 3,000 precious lives that cannot be replaced. But it was interactive. And when they look to see and do the after-action report, there was a piece here and a piece here and a piece here that ultimately painted the picture that nobody got because they were looking at collective information rather than the interactive information. And then finally he talks about ambiguity. And that's the inability to actually conceptualize threats. And accomplishments don't add up to comprehensive or enduring success. It's that kind of frustration to actually look and see what the threat is. Many times when we deal with business owners, I'm a partner with my partner, Wade Myers, a business partner, Wade Myers, who's an old Army Ranger. We go into businesses usually at the point that an entrepreneur's owned it for several years. He or she's in their late 50s, early 60s. They've got everything tied up in what it is that they built. They usually don't have large outside portfolio, but they built something that's of value theoretically that could be worth several $1 million. And now they're going into a whole new ambiguity where they don't understand the process of actually capitalizing on that wealth that they've created. And many times the threats that they think are the real threats to their company actually aren't the threats. And the threats that they dismiss many times are the threats that can really destroy the value. So the ambiguity piece is a big part of the environment that we live in. So what do? In Ram Charan, in the Attacker's Advantage, and this is a great book, and I'm hoping to have him on in the future. We're starting communication to see if we can get him on the show there. He's written several great books on leadership in this environment, but he has written one called The Attacker's Advantage, and here's what he says about today's business environment and about the leadership that's needed. He said, the immense uncertainty I see in today's business leaders facing is something truly unique in its scale, its speed, the ferocity of its impact, and its increasing ubiquity. It's qualitatively different by orders of magnitude from anything that has gone on before. So if you have the perception that the rules have changed, that in essence the ground is shifting underneath you, that's not just you. That's a reality. He goes on to say, talks about the idea of structural uncertainty. Here's what he says. He says, what's new is structural uncertainty. It is structural because the forces now at work can explode the existing structure of your market space or your industry, putting at risk of being drastically diminished or completely eliminated. So you've seen there's you have billions of Chinese, you have billions of Indians that are coming into the marketplace. You have a whole generation that was raised on this technology, and they're just a new idea away of totally disrupting industries. And so he boils it down to this. He says that the fundamental leadership challenge of today is taking control of uncertainty. He said that is the challenge of our time. And so that's what we want to do in the coming weeks, is share that with you and give you the hope of how you can do that. Where do you go to look for a model to compete in this high-speed, high-stress, chaotic environment? Well, I would submit to you, and I want to make the case to you, that an organization that's been doing that successfully since 1775 is our own United States Marine Corps. The United States Marine Corps has to fight in those environments, in that VUCA environment. And so what I've learned over the years, and what I traveled to Iraq, and even though I served many years and many pounds ago, I went to Iraq in 05 and 07 and studied there how these young Marines in combat that I was with them, how they make decisions, communicate those decisions, and decide in those decisions where there is this instant volatility, where there's this uncertainty, where there's complexity, and where's this ambiguity. And so most of the time, I've got a picture for those of you that are just listening. Some of you have seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, where the famous questions are asked, did your parents have any children that lived? And most people think that is the model of Marine Corps leadership. Well, it's actually not. And Marine Corps boot camp's a transformational process, but the actual leadership model that takes place on the other side of boot camp is certainly not like that at all. And that's not just my opinion. Harvard Business Review documented a study done by McKinsey & Company. McKinsey & Company is one of the top management consulting firms in the world. And they studied a list of 50 companies with reputations for frontline leadership development. And these companies included some names that you hear around the household all the time. Marriott Corporation, Home Depot, KFC, Ritz-Carlton, and right here in Dallas, our very own Southwest Airlines. A couple of guys on the McKinsey team were old Marines, and they said, well, why don't you guys take a look at how the Marines do it? And kind of the response from the McKinsey leadership was, hey, you guys just break things and kill people. What does that have to do with the business world? But as persistent as Marines are prone to be, they persisted, and they actually incorporated the Marine Corps into this study, and they studied them for 3 months with over 100 interviews, and here's what they concluded. McKinsey and Company concluded, and again, this was published in Harvard Business Review, that the team concluded that the United States Marine Corps outperformed all other organizations when it came to engaging the hearts of the front line, and that the Marines did so by using managerial practices that, although rarely found in the for-profit world, are relevant and applicable to business. So not only is the business world finding out about that, Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania said there's no better preparation for the rigors of running a business than the intense training of the U.S. Marine Corps. The Wall Street Journal talks about that Marine leadership is actually the product. Here's what they say. They say, in a way, Matt Pottinger wrote this. He said, in a way, I see the Marines as a microcosm of America at its best. Their focus isn't on weapons and tactics, but on leadership. That's the whole point of the Marines. And the next one we see, St. Louis Post-Dispatch asks this question: how can you make your office more flexible, more adaptable to new situations, and quicker to react with a higher level of performance? First of all, think and act like Marines, for one thing. And so you're seeing this across the board. In Inc. magazine, they wrote that the fundamental principles of Marine Corps leadership are not only applicable on the battlefields, but also in the boardrooms of global corporations. So slowly but surely, the world is waking up to the fact that there is a model that works in this high-speed, high-stress, chaotic environment. Jon Arquette, who's with the Harvard Business School, who's has made a lifetime of studying leadership and teams. Here's what he says. He said teams work when they are created for the right reasons and when they are created in the right way. The organization that I think that does the best job of meeting these requirements is the U.S. Marine Corps. And so, again, there's hope out there, and this, although it may sound foreign, and we're going to do away with a lot of myths in the coming week, there is a model, and there is a way to teach people how to do those things, to decide, communicate, execute in really high-speed, high-stress chaos. Harper Collins said anyone facing entrenched or predatory competitors, short time frames, chaotic markets, or obstacles in every direction has a simple choice: learn to move fast, change on the fly, and inspire employees or die. The Marines are here to help. Next one on there, Business Week. Given the tough terrain corporate America is traversing, it may be time to call in the Marines. So hopefully you're starting to hear a trend here. And here's one of my favorites. You may have heard of this little company called Federal Express or FedEx now. What you may not know is that Fred Smith, the founder of it, is an old Marine captain that served during Vietnam. And here's what he said. He said the Marine Corps has developed the finest leadership training in the world. The leadership principles taught by the Marines are universally applicable and are the bedrock of the FedEx management system. You talk about a guy that came in and totally disrupted an industry, that brought in a whole new way to play, even though his term paper in school, he only got a C on the idea. But he was actually to make that decision. He communicated that decision to stockholders and stakeholders and his employees and customers, and he's ultimately been able to go out and execute that decision in this type environment. So here's one of the things that the Marines say. This is kind of and it's fundamental to have this as part of your philosophy. If you live in this type of environment that we just talked about, then your underlying philosophy, your underlying doctrine must recognize that. Here's what the Marines say. Disorder is the inherent characteristic of business. They say war, we say business. We can never eliminate it. Here's the facts. Plans are going to go awry. There's going to be information instructions that's unclear, that's misinterpreted. Communications will fail. That's a reality. Mistakes, unforeseen events, they're commonplace. And then hopefully not within your office, but on the battlefield, violent, unnerving sights and sounds. This is the reality that leaders have to be developed within the Marine Corps. And the way that they do that, like the study said from McKinsey, it is relevant and applicable to business. So the Marines say when the simple is difficult and the difficult is impossible, we have friction. Friction can be either mental or physical. It can be internal or external. And then they go on to say here that we must be prepared to thrive in an environment of chaos, uncertainty, constant change, and friction. So how do you do that, and what are we going to be talking about in the coming weeks to best cope with that uncertainty, disorder, and fluidity? Command and control has to be decentralized. In essence, you have to be not only personal leader in your business, but you have to become a leadership teacher, a teacher that you can guide and coach your team on making those decisions, communicating those decisions right at the very front line. And so I'll leave you with a quick story here, how this is manifested in the real world. And then in our next show, we'll talk about a framework for making those decisions and executing those decisions. But when I was in Iraq in 05 and 07, I was embedded with units that would patrol wonderful little places like outhouses like Ramadi and Fallujah. And so if you can picture a 20-year-old young guy that 2 years earlier mama couldn't get out of bed, he's now leading these squad-size units, 13-man units, out in the marketplace, and they're fighting what General Krulak called a 3-block war. In one block, they are setting up perimeters and administering humanitarian aid and medical help to the populace. In the next block, one of the favorite things for Iraqis to do, if you stole my girlfriend, then I would go to the Marines and tell them that you were Al-Qaeda. And so this young Marine corporal or sergeant has to make a decision on the spot there. Does he roll up that Iraqi and certainly make him an enemy, or does he let him go and risk the fact that his team could be blown up later on because this guy truly was Al-Qaeda? In the third block, they're in what sometimes the media refers to as a low-intensity firefight. And I can tell you, if you've ever had lead headed your way with your name on it, there's nothing low intensity about it. But these young guys have to make the transition from peacekeeper to policeman to all-out warrior. They have to do it in a fraction of a second, and they don't have time to call back to the home office and get clearance from the VP. And just for kicks and grins that I ask corporate audiences, how would you like your young employees to have that type of responsibility? And just for kicks and grins, we're going to follow them around with CNN cameras 24/7 trying to catch them screwing up. So that's what we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks. Yes, we live in an environment of high-speed, high-stress chaos, but there is hope, and there is a system of leadership that works that will teach you to decide, communicate, execute in a high-speed, high-stress, chaotic environment. I look forward to talking with you guys next week. Semper Fi, this is Gene Blanton. We're out here.